Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Prime Minister Imran Khan returned from a two-day visit to China. Yesterday, he was invited there by the Chinese Premier, His Excellency Li Keqiang. According to the joint statement, the Prime Minister also met the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, and also Chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, Li Shansu. So we have our panel today, and we want to discuss some of the issues that have also been flagged in the joint statement. And I have with me Mr. Einar Tangen, who's an analyst based in Beijing. I also have Zoon Ahmed Khan, who joins us from Islamabad, but is based in China, doing her studies, and Mustafa Hyder, who is the executive director of Pak China Institute and joins us from Beijing. Let me begin, Mustafa, with you. You were there, you were looking at how this went. What were the optics and what was the substance?
Ejaz, thank you. There were three key things which have come out of this visit. One is the geopolitics and strategic happenings in our part of the world, in South Asia and particularly Kashmir. China has given an unequivocal, very categorical statement, support Pakistan's stance on Kashmir and our core interest, which is Kashmir, and it has come from none other than President Xi Jinping. Number two, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. There were some quarters questioning the government's commitment to CPEC, and I think those reservations and doubts should be now scattered and resolved because we have moved forward with the CPEC projects like the monumental ML1, which is the very strategic railway project and of a mammoth amount of billions of dollars, which has been agreed to and signed. And also the second phase of CPEC has been approved between both the sides. And thirdly, Ejaz, the cultural component, the people-to-people component, which is equally important. Confucius Institutes, further Confucius Institutes are going to be built in Pakistan in our universities, and more Pakistani students and youth will get scholarships to go to Pakistan. So I think whether it's CPEC, whether it's people-to-people, and whether it is our core interests of geopolitics, China has given a very clear, loud and clear message. And the timing is very interesting because it's just before the summit of President Xi with Modi, with Prime Minister Modi of India. And it's come at a very crucial time when Pakistan needed this most. And it has, I think, boosted the morale of the people of Pakistan and also further cemented the already very steadfast and historical ties between Pakistan and China.
Okay, great. Let me just quickly go back to what you said about the statement on Kashmir. And it says, and I'm reading from the joint statement, this is after Pakistan briefed the Chinese side on the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, which is actually the occupied and annexed Kashmir, including its concerns, position, and current urgent issues. The Chinese side responded that it was paying close attention to the current situation in Jammu and Kashmir and reiterated that the Kashmir issue is a dispute left from history and should be properly and peacefully resolved based on the UN Charter, which is excellent, the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. And then it says, and bilateral agreements. What exactly is that referring to, if not Shimla or the Lahore MOU? And given that India has unilaterally changed the status quo in occupied Kashmir, annexing that territory, what is the future of those bilateral arrangements?
Firstly, China has clearly shown that it's a third party in this dispute because Ladakh is involved in it as well. So if you look at the past statements, and I think this statement clearly says that this is a disputed territory. This has to be resolved. It is not an internal matter of India. And the UN resolutions, which what is Pakistan's position as well, the UN resolutions which say there should be a plebiscite in Kashmir and that this has to be resolved through negotiations, through peaceful settlement. And this is not part of India. It is not part of the territory of India. So I think that if you look at the statement overall, I think it's the strongest statement from any of Pakistan's allies thus far.
Okay, that seems about right because the Indian government's official spokesperson, Ravish Kumar, said that his government had seen reports of the meeting in response to a question from the media about the issue. And to quote his precise words, India's position has been consistent and clear that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. China is well aware of our position. It is not for other countries to comment on the internal affairs of India. This was the statement issued by the Indian External Affairs Ministry's spokesperson. And interestingly, President Xi Jinping is scheduled to meet the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Chennai later this week. Mustafa, stay with me. Let me quickly go to Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, since you are well aware of how Chinese policies and strategies work, would you consider this Chinese statement with reference to Jammu and Kashmir as significant?
Well, yes, but not necessarily the same way as my previous colleague. I would suggest that you pay a lot of attention to the last words, that it be resolved bilaterally.
Correct.
China is kind of in this situation where it wants to acknowledge the long-term friendship and ties with Pakistan, but it also wants to deal with what is fast emerging as a kind of global meltdown, which quickly will lead probably to a recession. It wants to bring India on board in terms of, achieving a peaceful regional solution. And you'll notice that it was not trilateral. China did not inject itself into the situation. What they said was bilateral. Now, obviously, the timing of this is very significant. Giving time to Pakistan prior to the meeting with Modi is, once again, an acknowledgement of the long-standing ties. But, you should be also aware that, China is trying to play nice and not have a situation under the old colonial divide and rule where India is used as a doorstop to China and to the new Asian century. So I think for all concerned, I think India, China, Pakistan have to come to some sort of resolution. Kashmir, obviously important. China was extremely surprised that this was the big initial foray by the Modi government. But they're going to have a chance to talk about that, and hopefully there'll be some sort of resolution.
Okay. Let me just to Ms. Khan here. Ms. Khan, what are your first thoughts with reference to the visit? And specifically, I will come to the CPEC part of it, but the Kashmir issue, as I said to Mustafa, that the bilateral part of it I thought was very significant, which is where Mr. Tangen also agrees with me. What do you think? What is your sense?
Right after Article 370 was revoked, I also had the opportunity to be in Beijing on a few panels. It was me, a Chinese, and an Indian. And the discussion essentially was, and the point that I emphasized on was that India has a very provocative posture, not only with respect to Pakistan recently, but also with respect to China. When it comes to direct dialogue with Pakistan vis-a-vis the Kashmir issue or other regional concerns that both countries share, India opposes to be on the negotiation table. When it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, India remains the only country that opposes to endorse it. And also 2 years ago in 2017, we saw that big face-off between China and India over the Doklam issue. It was one more way for India to show that they're not playing fair in the region. They've had complications with Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the region at large. So in that sense, I think on some level, the Chinese, even if they say that it is a bilateral concern, India and Pakistan have to resolve this and their misunderstandings between and amongst each other. On some level, China understands that Pakistan's reservations are not in vain. Of course, China has other mechanisms, even though they say that Kashmir is between the two countries. between the two countries. They also have a stake, as Mustafa mentioned. Ladakh is a region that is of concern to China. So they are clearly a third party. And also, if we look at China's Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was initiated by China, it is playing an active role in trying to improve the understanding between India and Pakistan. As members of the SCO, Pakistan and India cannot afford to be in active conflict. So this is one way for China to, whether they say it directly or not, but in one way to mediate or improve the understanding between India and Pakistan. And the SCO remains the only platform that India and Pakistan share. So China's efforts to bring both India and Pakistan as members is one way to encourage effective dialogue, regardless of them saying that it's a bilateral concern.
Absolutely. Great insight. Mustafa, what Zoon Ahmed Khan is saying, and I largely agree with her, in the sense that, if you look at how essentially India has sounded the death knell for SAARC, SCO, which is a regional forum, remains perhaps the only platform. Well, Pakistan is not part of BIMSTEC. India has been, promoting BIMSTEC, but we leave that aside. And so on the SCO platform, India and Pakistan are not the heavyweights that they are at SAARC. So interestingly enough, and perhaps also ironically, India has to essentially be cognizant of the concerns of the heavyweight regional players in SCO. So do you think there is space for China to actually position itself in terms of being able to mediate between India and Pakistan, or do you think that's very optimistic?
I think we have had a diplomatic feat, whether it's with the US or whether it's with China. If just 3 days ago, there were senators from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the US which have shared China's perspective and Pakistan's perspective. So the three countries, Pakistan, China and the US, and President Trump has offered to mediate multiple times to India's disturbance and reservations. So all of these countries are sharing Pakistan's perspective.
But Mustafa, let me interject here. Without prejudice to what you are saying, the issue is about the substance of any such mediation. In fact, what I have seen and what I can gather is more about facilitation rather than mediation per se. Secondly, most countries, and this is barring the UK Labour Party resolution, which kind of put the bee in the Indian bonnet, rest of it is about, some of the voices are talking about the human rights situation in occupied Kashmir. Others are saying, that are slightly more vociferous, are saying that, you should reverse 370. There is no real, sort of takers for the epicenter of the problem. The epicenter being Kashmiris' total alienation from India, which then gives them the sort of, the desire to resist, and then that resistance begets the Indian oppression. So the challenge for us, it seems to me, is to actually get the world to understand that the epicenter of the problem lies somewhere else.
Yes. You see, I agree with you to a certain extent, Ejaz, but if you look at statements from China and you don't look at this statement in isolation, I reiterate my point of the third party, which China itself has claimed that it is, because of Ladakh, when the annexation took place. And after that, if you look at Mr. Wang Yi, the foreign minister's statements, he has continuously said that China is a third party, and this is affecting the regional stability, peace, and harmony of the region. So I think that if you are expecting that some country will go out of its way and
no, I'm not expecting that at all.
To its head of
quite the contrary, actually.
That, I think, those are unfounded and unrealistic expectations. But I think the pressure is building up, and that is what we wanted, and which we were initially worried about, that was not happening on Kashmir. And I think that pressure, that momentum, is building from the international community, and the international community which matters. And I think that pressure will build up, and that momentum will only continue to actually affect India's policies towards Kashmir. Because other than that, if you see the policy of RSS, it's a very aggressive policy, a very aggressive unilateral policy to completely transform the demography of Kashmir, the religion of Kashmir, so they have a huge strategy. So I think to slow down that strategy and ultimately reverse that strategy, international community is key. And what I'm saying is that we have managed to mobilize the international community to put that pressure, whether it's about human rights, whether it's about other things. It's at the end that human rights is in Kashmir. So
Okay.
The issue of Kashmir is on the international arena. It's on the radar, and there's a red flag which is being waved in front of India again and again and again. And I think that is qualifies as a success.
Okay. Mr. Tangen, let me ask a slightly different question, which is that how does the Chinese policy and strategic community look at India? Because India has obviously been getting very close to the United States. The US has a certain kind of approach to China's near abroad. So obviously the Chinese policy and strategic community is concerned about that. So what are the salient features of how China actually deals with India?
Well, as I said earlier, the concern in China is that India is being used by the United States as, in essence, a doorstop, that this is part of the old colonial divide and rule, set one group after another, and in the confusion, take what you want. So this is a major concern. And it would, even apart from Kashmir and other issues, this would affect the growth of Asia if you have two large entities like that going at it. It certainly would not help Pakistan. It would not help the surrounding area. So at this point, Beijing is looking to find a way of threading the needle, keeping its friendship and ties, economic and otherwise, cultural, with Pakistan, but at the same time, trying to figure out how they can keep India at least neutral, so that it's not a situation where you have armies facing off against each other, or trying to provoke interference or being the tool of, in this case, the United States.
Okay, so how does China look, because one of the things that India has been greatly desirous of for the last 20 years, if not more, is to create a powerful blue water navy, and they've been trying to get the aircraft carriers also, and they have these arrangements with the US Navy and the Australian Navy, and the Japanese Navy. And they have been part of some of the patrols, not exactly in South or East China Sea, but closer to those areas. So how does China react to that kind of development?
Well, in essence, they see this as kind of a strategic move by India to assert its independence. I'm not independence, just assert its own path. Now, remember, China is under no illusions. They know that India will look to the U.S. as an umbrella, a security umbrella. The question is, will India embrace the rest of Asia in terms of being an economic partner? They have benefited from things like the AIIB, where it was started by China, but at this point, India has received the lion's share of help in terms of projects and loans. So, China is not looking to establish itself as a hegemon. What they want is regional stability, especially at a time when they feel that the United States is trying to push a different worldview, one that goes contrary to all the institutions that were created post-World War II.
Absolutely. That was Mr. Tangen speaking with us. Thank you also, Mustafa, Hyder, Syed. Zoon Ahmed Khan, let me just get back to you before I wrap up this segment. The same question, more or less, to you about, since you are interacting with the Chinese strategic thinkers and think tanks and the rest of it, what exactly do you think is the Chinese policy? Obviously, as Mr. Tangen is saying, China is thinking in terms of a balance, but here's the problem. China itself is an emerging power, in some ways challenging an existing global power, and India, given its size, is also a state that wants to project power. So there is, if you go by structural realism, there is a certain kind of inevitability about the potential for conflict. How do you think the Chinese look at it?
You know, what I study is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was mentioned earlier in this program. China has a vision to maybe increase Eurasian connectivity through economic, cultural, different various dimensions. And that vision is basically it takes inspiration from the Silk Road. So I'm trying to answer your question in as straightforward a manner as possible. What I understand of Chinese thinkers is that they understand they are being lured into a conflict by the United States. That is the power which is somewhat in decline, and China is on the rise. And this is the last thing that China wants, whether be it Afghanistan, be it Doklam, be it East Asia, be it with respect to the Korean Gulf. There are many ways in which the Western imperialists and the Western powers are trying to lure China into a conflict, into a position where China is going to react. But for China, the stakes are much more long-term. For China, stability means that we are able to create a world, create a system that is based on mutual dependence, that's away from a zero-sum mentality, and we can have corridors like CPEC, different corridors that enhance economic cooperation, trade, cultural understanding, etc. And this can be the way to actually allow for a world that is not based on zero-sum mindset, that is not driven by conflict, but that can result in long-term stability. So this is China's essential vision. The SEO is a part of it, as the other panelists mentioned, AIIB. They want countries to be able to understand that we have much more in common than we realize. So Chinese thinking towards international relations, China's vision of how to be a leader, how to be in a leadership position, right now does not entail challenging the West. They constantly say that we are not challenging the West. One example of this is that China has linked the Belt and Road Initiative with UN Sustainable Development Goals. They are trying to make the West, or powers that are feeling threatened and provoking China, realize that they're not opposing the current system. They're trying to enhance it. We realize that they're developing countries that had problems that were left unaddressed, and China is in a position to be able to address those problems and create mechanisms and platforms that can help us look at long-term solutions.
That's a smart strategy.
One way to understand China is to look into how, yeah. I mean, it's very different from a Western thinking, and I feel, having spent 4 years in China, that we are much more exposed to Western way of thinking and imperialism and colonialism than we are to what China, from my understanding, envisions itself as, if it is to be the world leader, which we do foresee in the near future.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Zoon Khan. China does not really want to challenge the current security architecture. But of course, as a rising power, China wants to be in a leadership position. That's all as far as the Prime Minister's visit to China was concerned. We'll take a short break, and at the other end of the break, we're going to discuss the Turkish offensive in northeastern Syria. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We move on to discuss Turkish military offensive in northeastern Syria, which began on Wednesday after President Trump announced that U.S. troops would pull back from the area. Of course, we'll discuss that decision has gotten a storm of criticism. But as far as the Syrian Democratic Forces are concerned, they're saying that they essentially scuppered a ground offensive incursion attempt by, as their official statement put it, the Turkish occupation army. To see what's going on, we have with us Michael Arnold, who is an analyst based in Istanbul. We also have with us Vanessa Beeley, who is an independent investigative journalist, also a photographer and a researcher, writer, and joins us from Damascus. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Ms. Beeley here. Ms. Beeley, What is Damascus? I mean, obviously, Damascus is going to be very concerned about this, and they've already said that they deeply oppose this. But is there any particular policy that you think is something that they can pursue in terms of essentially encountering this offensive, or is just more bluster?
No, I don't think it's bluster at all from the Syrian government or from Damascus. But I think the fact on the ground is that the Kurdish factions that are now facing attack by the Turkish occupation forces, which include, of course, the Free Syrian Army and other such extremist factions that are forming part of the Turkish military front, as they did in Afrin, of course. For the Kurdish factions to be able to defend themselves effectively, they should now, as they are appearing to do so, be negotiating with Damascus and looking for help or support now from Russia, Iran, and from the Syrian Arab Army, having, of course, profited from the power multiplication by the United States for the last few years, since 2014, effectively.
Do you think they'd be able to get that help?
Yeah, of course, Damascus has always been very clear that it's prepared to support any sort of negotiations between the Kurdish factions. And we have to remember, I mean, the Kurdish population in Syria is less than 10%. Of that 10%, a much smaller percentage is forming the separatist faction of effectively US proxies on the ground in the northeast.
Okay, so obviously Damascus is deeply opposed to this zone, that buffer zone that Turkey wants to create in northeastern Syria, that entire belt along that border. But there is a military offensive going on. Do you think that Iran or any of the other, Syrian government's allies could actually get involved directly into that conflict zone?
Well, of course. I mean, this conflict is going to come into direct confrontation with the Syrian Arab Army posts in areas like, for example, Hasaka. And of course, the belt will include the ethnic cleansing of any Assyrian and Arab ethnic communities within that belt, and the imposition of, as I've already said, a sort of a Turkish proxy occupation by terrorist or extremist sectarian forces in that area. So it is in the Kurdish interest, of course, to defend those areas that they have already effectively ethnically cleansed and occupied on behalf of the United States. So we have a situation where I guess the Syrian Arab Army is going to hold its ground. So certainly that will bring it into conflict directly with the Turkish ground troops if they reach that point.
Yeah, okay. So the military is not just using ground troops. There's also artillery fire and air power being used. Michael, what is the sense in Istanbul? What we have seen of these wars over the last 15, 18 years is that states get into these wars and then they really get bogged down. I mean, is there a sense that it could perhaps lead to that kind of result?
Not so much, and I think it's important to say off the start of this. These tend to be very difficult discussions to have, if only because the rhetoric and the discourse around this issue is really what I think is best described as delirious. I mean, we have talk of genocide and ethnic cleansing and all sorts of things, and it's not very clear where this is coming from in reality. I think the fact that on the Turkish side that they waited so long after, we're talking at least 4 years of bringing this issue up repeatedly to actually engage in the operation east of the Euphrates. I think this speaks to the level of cautiousness with which Turkey approaches this operation and which they've approached their operations in the past. It doesn't mean that everything is done perfectly. War is messy, of course, but anything you could argue that the Turkish side is extra cautious in this, and so I think they'll be well aware of avoiding anything that would get them bogged down, so to speak, in this environment.
The other interesting thing, Michael, that I thought, also kind of ironic because a lot of the Democrats, it's been a bipartisan sort of criticism, but lots of former Obama administration officials have deeply criticized the decision by President Trump to pull back troops from that area. But the fact is that Obama administration itself was very wary of getting involved in Syria, and they thought that this was a wicked situation. So I'm not sure if that criticism is anything more, in strategic or policy terms, is more than just the domestic political sort of rivalries between the former Obama administration officials and the current Trump administration. Would you agree with me?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a fair point. I mean, the reality is, though, is that support for the YPG, which, of course, the links that it has to the PKK in Turkey have been made abundantly clear by analysts from all over the world and was rebranded as the SDF. This support began under the Obama administration, continued under the Trump administration as well, and Turkey, who is, of course, a NATO ally, has brought this up repeatedly with the United States over the years, saying this is not sustainable. This is a problem for us. This is a security concern. And even those in the United States now who are critical of Trump's decision and are being very vocal about Turkey's action, they acknowledge that Turkey has legitimate security concern in this issue, but yet somehow they are not supposed to do anything about it. And I think, again, just sort of, if I may add, in terms of the kind of the level of discourse that we have around this issue, is all of a sudden, after years of bombardment from the Syrian regime, and specifically recently in Idlib, with many people killed and many people displaced, having a lot of silence from various Western media outlets in particular. Now, all of a sudden, they are, expressing this great concern over Turkey's involvement. So I think, it's difficult to cut through a lot of the politics and the rhetoric to really kind of to see what's actually happening on the ground.
Absolutely. In fact, another sort of, strange things that one comes across. I mean, memories are short, perhaps. So, one of the criticisms is that this will allow the Kurdish fighters have lots of these ISIS fighters that were arrested, and now these ISIS fighters will escape, and there's going to be an ISIS threat and all that. But at the same time, even during the Obama administration, the US was constantly pressuring Turkey to take charge and be in the lead to take on the ISIS. So now if Turkey is moving into this, area which it wants to create as a buffer zone, it's kind of strange that the same people are saying that this is going to, allow the ISIS to reorganize and remobilize and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the ISIS factor is a genuine concern. But again, we should remember that, in terms of actually facing direct attacks by ISIS, Turkey has borne the brunt, of that in the region in many cases, definitely not the United States. So they're well aware of the threat they represent. And in fact, obviously, in their previous operations, they have taken them on directly and continue to, conduct operations within Turkey as well with known cells to be arresting these types of figures. But I think another important thing to point out with the ISIS issue is that we don't actually know what the numbers in these prisons are. We know there are prisoners being held, but if you read the different reports and you listen to the YPG itself, we have numbers ranging from anywhere from 700 to 750 to 20,000. That's a big
Absolutely.
range, and we don't actually know who these people are, where they're from, who are we actually counting in all of this. So it is a concern, no doubt about it. But again, I think we have to really get a grip on what's really going on here before jumping to too many conclusions.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Mike. Let me go back to Ms. Beeley here. Ms. Beeley, it's very clear that it's a shattered country. Multiple factions. If one were to make a flow chart of who supported whom at what point, and the various sort of alliances coming together, alliances coming apart, that flow chart will be a jumble. It'll be mind-boggling. So it's extremely difficult to somehow work out which side one wants to support or which side to criticize. Is that your sense also?
No. Okay. First of all, in my opinion, and I spend considerable amounts of time in Syria, 85% of Syrian territory is now back under the security of the Syrian government and the Syrian army. And among that 85%, you have, as you quite rightly point out, a huge number of minority sects, including, of course, the Syrian Christians, who have only just recently been liberated in northern Hama by the Syrian Arab Army. After 8 years of intense bombardment, the targeting of hospitals and schools, which of course everybody always attributes to the Syrian government only, within the Syrian Christian towns and communities bordering northern Hama and Idlib. Now, those terrorist factions in Idlib are being supported, promoted, supplied arms to by
Let me just
Turkey.
get a clarification from you. When you say various terrorist factions, you using the term in relation to any and everyone that is opposed to the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad?
I'm talking here exclusively about Idlib. Now, Brett McGurk has made it very clear in July 2017, I believe, that Idlib is the largest al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. In all of the occupied areas or previously occupied areas of Syria, the dominant force has been largely Nusra Front, which has merged together some of the lesser extremist factions that I do not consider to be legitimate Syrian opposition. I consider them to be either foreign mercenaries or extremist factions that have taken up arms not only against the Syrian government and the Syrian state, but against their own people. And if we are talking about Turkish security, why does Turkey need to actually invade Syrian territory in order to provide itself with security? It could create a security corridor on its own territory. We are entirely denying international law in this discussion. We're ignoring it. Where is the international law violation discussion on your program right now?
Okay. Where is the international law violation discussion, Michael Arnold?
Well, I think according to Turkey's perspective, its operations are perfectly legitimate within the context of international law. Again, if we move back from the sort of deliriousness of the discussion, if this were any other country we were talking about here, I mean, I don't like to use this type of argument, but in some ways the discussion around this topic has become so difficult to get through that it's necessary to illustrate. If we were talking about, for example, the United States or any other country in Europe or really anywhere else in the world that had clearly a hostile force that is connected directly to a group which the international community, for the most part, considers to be a terrorist organization, being the PKK, and you had a group that is allied with them, if not being directly a part of them, along the border of the state, and this state announced that they were going to make an operation against them, I don't think too many people would be would blink an eye at that issue. Furthermore, although there's different interpretations of this agreement, the Adada agreement, at least in the Turkish interpretation, provides it the legal space to do cross-border operations in order to secure itself against PKK and
Okay,
YPG.
Michael, stay. Okay, right, Michael, stay with me, Ms. Beeley. Here's at least the Turkish interpretation of international law as put out by Michael here. You want to say something to that?
No, I mean, this is not an interpretation of international law. This is an interpretation of an existing agreement between the Syrian government and the Turkish government. And if your guest is citing international law and saying that Turkey has its right to defend itself against what it considers to be a terrorist organization on its borders and threatening its territory, then surely Syria has that same right to defend itself against an invasion of terrorist entities that effectively are financed and promoted and supported not only by the Turkish government, by the US coalition, and by the Gulf states and by Israel.
Okay.
That is a violation of international law.
Okay, thank you. That was Vanessa Beeley speaking with us. Let me go back to Michael. Michael, she made a distinction between the agreement between Syria and Turkey and international law tenets. So I think that's a fine agreement. But here's the thing: when we talk about Syria, who exactly are we talking about? I mean, there is the Bashar al-Assad government that represents Syria. Does it represent Syria? I mean, there are questions about that. There are his allies that say, yes, he does. And there are the others who say that he doesn't, because of the question of legitimacy for him, this entire thing goes back, the genesis of this goes back to that particular issue.
It's an issue that hangs over the entire process, and of course, this is something that the major players in the country are hoping to work towards solving. Right, the ongoing Astana process under the auspices of the UN, of course, being led by Russia, Iran, and Turkey. They've come now. They have an agreement on forming a constitutional committee with the hope that this will move towards solving this legitimacy issue one way or another. So, when you're getting into the questions of legitimacy, it's a difficult one. From the Turkish angle, again, Turkey has almost 4 million Syrians living within its borders. It has another few million under areas that are under its direct influence in northern Syria. So it has, at this point, almost 40% of the Syrian population, sort of under its care, under its influence. So in that sense, you could make the argument that it has, obviously a major stake and some say in kind of how the process is going to play out. So, the issue of legitimacy is going to continue until the Syrians themselves, of course, with the help of their various patrons, come together and try to solve these very, very difficult issues. But that's the only way the issue of legitimacy will ever disappear from this discussion. Absolutely.
Michael, I'm just going to read to you a few sentences from a very interesting analysis on this situation by Dr. Kamran Bukhari. And he says, in purely objective geopolitical terms and with all its ills, Turkey is the only state actor in the region with the capability to intervene in Syria. It is also a NATO ally, which Washington cannot afford to lose to Moscow. Turkey has already moved away from the West on so many different levels and will continue drifting away unless we, as in he's advising Washington, we engage with it. At this point, US and Turkish interests appear to be converging in that Ankara needs and wants to play a major role in Syria, and the region and the United States needs Turkey to take the lead in doing so. How much of this analysis would you agree with?
Well, I think broadly speaking, it's making a point. But I think also, and this has been part of the issue for a long time, is at least on the surface, American policy towards Syria has been inconsistent, and you could possibly even say incoherent. Now, there may be other plans below the surface, but at least from what we can see, it's very difficult to get a read on what they actually wanted to do beyond defeating ISIS. That became the sole objective in 2014, 2015 onwards. And beyond that, it's difficult to get a read on exactly what that is. Turkey, obviously, as a NATO ally, of course, should be, in theory, a trusted partner of Washington. But I think, and this is, again, what Turkey has been saying for a number of years, is exactly that, saying we're a NATO ally, we're in the region, we have the second largest army in NATO and the capabilities to do this, but yet you are supporting groups and a group in northeastern Syria that we have repeatedly told you is a security threat to us, and the fact that you've acknowledged that it's a security threat to us, yet you continue to support it. So I think there's a certain exasperation here in Turkey that you feel from not only officials and commentators, but from the general public at large, that the United States has, saying one thing and doing another, and there's a lack of trust there.
Michael, before I wrap up, just to add a bit of levity to this discussion, I don't know if you've seen the Guardian report, which quotes President Trump's statement about the fact that he learned that Kurds didn't help the U.S. During the Normandy invasion. And he actually used this to defend his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and enable a Turkish offensive against U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters in the region. And he said that he has actually learned of this from a very powerful article. So this is, when analysts talk about the fact that this is a very well thought out strategy and, a lot of man hours have gone into this. And then when President Trump comes up with something like that, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, that one, some of his comments lately have been, even for him, have been, I think, off the charts in some way.
Are you saying he's been outperforming himself?
It seems to be in some ways, and I don't know if it's part of his, madman strategy or if it's something else. But I think, the point that can be made here is, Trump is making these decisions, Trump is saying these things, but clearly within the United States, especially with this recent decision, amongst the security apparatus, the military apparatus in general, and amongst both Democrats and a lot of Republicans, is that they do not agree with this decision for various reasons. Now, that may be hypocritical in some ways, but it's clear that he is going against the grain within his own country. And, I think, it remains to be seen what the American position will actually be, even in the next few weeks or few months down the road, as they sort this out internally as well.
Absolutely. The blob is already pushing back, frankly, in terms of, saying that this is a bad policy. But thank you so much, Michael Arnold, for speaking with us and giving us your insight. This is all for today from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.